This conference will now be recorded.
First, as with many programs in our community, the pandemic threw a wrench into our airport master plan timeline. It has been a difficult year, and we're so excited to get back to work on this important master plan update. You'll soon hear what the Flightpath team was able to accomplish and what our next steps are. But first, I'd like to share some reminders about the overall project process. There are several reasons why now is the time to update our master plan. In the past, first, much has changed since our last airport master plan update. Our community is growing, jets are becoming more efficient, we're increasingly dependent on shipping items around the world overnight, and we need to design our future to make sure our airport plays the role we need it to, and to reflect the community as it brings in more families, more jobs, and more people who might need emergency support. In the present, we need to be sure our community airport is working toward meeting design standards for traffic that is already here. Our mission will be to listen to the community while striking a balance between the airport's needs and the community's vision. And in the future, it is time for us to determine the next 20 years of our airport's future. But we need to fully understand our options and the costs related to our decisions. Nothing has been decided yet, and we look forward to having you join us in this process. Our airport is essential to our way of life. Since we met last year, fire suppression aircraft fought dozens of fires from our airport: Shingle Creek, Big Hollow, Saddle Fire, Rock Path, Knowles Road, Neff's Fire, the list goes on. Having the airport in our community increases our access to aerial fire and medical support and helps keep us safe. And that's not the only way the airport helps our community. Heber Valley Airport supports good-paying jobs, keeps hundreds of acres of land from being developed, and allows the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to stock our lakes with fish. People have had life-saving medical evacuations here, have had marriage proposals here, and have taught school children STEM and aviation curriculum here. Heber Valley Airport is an important part of this community, even if you aren't a pilot. Now let's talk about how the airport is funded. I've said it before, but it's important to say it again. The airport doesn't run on local taxes. The National Airspace System, or NAS, is designed to be self-funded by users. A certain portion of every airline ticket sold goes into the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, as do cargo fees and fuel fees, at every airport in the region, the state, and the country. Those fees help airports continue to perform safety upgrades, construction projects, and other developments that are solely for NAS operations and improvements. In fact, it's called the Airport Improvement Fund, or AIP. The AIP will pay for 90% of this master plan update. Through federal grants, the program has also paid for the majority of construction projects completed at the Heber Airport over the decades. For example, the approximately $600,000 airport master plan is almost completely funded by the FAA and UDOT. The city's portion is $28,000 and is being paid for entirely by airport revenue. Your taxpayer dollars aren't being used here, and it's the city's goal to keep it that way. The city and the airport are completely committed to an open and transparent process. This is the community's airport, and we want you to be involved as much as possible. That's why we'd like to remind you that there are several ways to get accurate information about the program and the update. First of all, the website. HeberValleyFlightpath.com is the clearinghouse for the master plan update process. On it, we share past documents, frequently asked questions, and the draft chapters of the future airport master plan. If you've got a question about the project, we've probably already answered it in the FAQ section. If not, you can submit your question on the site and we'll get back to you with an answer. The blog, on the Flightpath website, you can sign up to receive information about the airport and project updates. It's a simple way to stay informed. The information comes to you. And meetings. There's several more opportunities to participate in the process before it ends. In fact, the next few steps are the most important for your input. So please stay involved. This is your airport. During our conversations tonight, you'll hear from several subject matter experts about the data they gathered, the federal standards we'll need to meet, and how you can impact the airport master plan update process. With me this evening, I have TO engineers, Jeremy Mcallister and Jared Wingo. Jeremy and Jared will provide a look at what we've accomplished as part of this process, including a review of the airport inventory and forecast, and also what there is left to be done. They will also participate in our Q&A session later this evening. From Heber City, we have our city manager, Matt Brower, our airport manager, our chair of the Airport Advisory Board, and these gentlemen bring a deep knowledge of how our airport is intertwined with our community and how that connectivity will guide airport plans moving forward. Matt, Travis, and Jason will participate in the Q&A at the end of the presentations. And finally, we have some committees. Several people are here tonight who are members of our 2 airport master plan committees. If you're in the audience and have your camera on, you can wave, and we're happy also to have you here. I skipped a slide. Will you back up, Katie? I just wanted to note that one of the other ways that you can get more information is we're starting to hold these, what we're calling airport tour and talks. We've had a couple already, and what we want to do is provide an opportunity for you to come and just ask questions and tour the airport. You can look at the maps, you can get the facts, and in a very informal setting, you can get your questions answered. The next 2 will be Wednesday, April the 14th at 10, and Tuesday, April the 27th at 5:00 p.m. And we will continue to hold these as long as there are people interested in coming to these tours. So at this point, I'd like to begin the presentation portion of the meeting. As a reminder, you're able to submit any questions you may have during this meeting to info@hebervalleyflightpath.com. We'll answer your questions during the live Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to begin with a presentation that sums up where we have been in the process, what we've accomplished so far, and sets the scenes for the next stages.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our conversation regarding the Heber Valley Airport. My name is Jared Wingo.
Can't hear anything.
Sorry about that.
I am the Aviation Planning Manager for TO Engineers and work directly with Jeremy Mcallister and our project team to address the more technical questions pertaining to aviation planning and operations. Since I joined TO Engineers in June 2020, I was unable to attend the kickoff meeting as part of our project team. Because of that fact, I wanted to provide a quick bio for you. I have been in the aviation industry for over 10 years, including stints at the state and federal levels, as well as in the private sector. I have a master's degree in aeronautical sciences focused on human factors and aviation safety, a bachelor's degree in aviation management, and hold a commercial pilot certificate in single and multi-engine airplanes. With that introduction, I want to spend some time talking with you about a few topics. Since our project has been severely impacted by COVID, we believe it is prudent to spend a few minutes refreshing ourselves with the master planning process to date before covering the new materials, including the socioeconomic overview and background, inventory of existing conditions, and the forecast of aviation. In the initial stage of the master plan process, we held our kickoff meeting on January 29th, 2020 at Heber Valley Elementary. At this meeting, our team presented several topics to roughly 150 participants, which began building the foundation of telling the airport's story and its role within the community and in the national airspace system. In addition, our team also presented an overview of the purpose and process of a master planning effort and the importance of the public involvement process. Again, to refresh our memories, here are those summarized. The master plan process can be divided into 3 distinct phases. The first phase, the investigative phase, consists of the ongoing efforts and focuses on topics such as socioeconomic information, inventory, aviation forecasting, and ends with the Facility Requirements chapter, which will be drafted later this year. After the Facility Requirements chapter, we will transition into the Solutions phase, which will consist of many conversations with project stakeholders as we begin conceptualizing alternatives and identifying a preferred alternative for the airport. After the preferred alternative has been identified, the project will begin wrapping up with the documentation phase. This phase will consist of developing a financial and implementation plan for the identified projects and then conveying these ideas into a narrative report and airport layout plan, or ALP, set. Ultimately, this process provides us with a path of telling the airport's story and the vision for the future. By identifying issues and needs, providing alternatives to consider, and justifying proposed development, our goal is to create a realistic plan for the airport. By completing this path, we are also adhering to multiple grant assurances that must be met as a recipient of FAA AIP funds. When we dive into potential growth at an airport, we begin by looking at population growth. The left table shows the historic and projected populations from 2010 to 2050 for several entities in the region. Going from left to right in the table, we have Heber City in blue, Park City in orange, Wasatch County in gray, and Summit County in yellow. These population projections are based on data from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and as the data shows, we are projecting a steady growth over the next 30 years throughout the region. The right table examines another factor on engaging historic economic performance at the community and county level. Per capita income, or PCI, takes all sources of aggregate income and divides it by the total population. Over time, this economic indicator is a solid performance measure for economic and social vitality of a community or region. For example, using the same color scheme as the population table and adding Utah in light blue and the United States in green, we can see Heber City is slightly below the PCI for Utah and the United States, while Wasatch County is slightly above the state and on par with the United States. On the upper end of the spectrum, we have Summit County and Park City, which are close to 1.5 to 2 times the per capita income of the state and country. On a state level, UDOT occasionally publishes statewide airport economic impact studies. While there is an updated version currently underway, we had to utilize the previously published version from 2004 for our analysis. In 2004, the total Heber Valley Airport economic impact output totaled $8.2 million, which when adjusted to 2020 dollars equates to an output of over $11.4 million. This output includes direct and indirect spending, payroll, and other services. In the same analysis, Heber Valley Airport consistently outperformed peer airports in the state, including visitor spending exceeding $1.3 million. When we compare this data with other studies, such as the Wasatch Back Economy Overview, the data falls in line with what you would expect for a regional economy involved in tourism. Additional socioeconomic information can be found in Chapter 2. The next section, the inventory chapter, provides information concerning the surrounding natural and physical environment, including airport location, existing zoning and land use, and the airport's airside and landside facilities. Just as a reference, additional information can be found in Chapter 3. Focusing on the airport location, the topography surrounding the Heber Valley Airport provides planners an understanding of the natural and man-made landscapes of the airport and surrounding area. With mountainous terrain surrounding the airport, the landscape has greatly influenced the planning and development of the airport and the valley throughout its history. When we examine the valley's climate, researchers have categorized this area as a warm summer continental climate. This climate type provides a wide range of seasonal temperatures ranging from an average low temperature of 35.4 degrees Fahrenheit to an average high temperature of 63.3 degrees Fahrenheit. One key component to placing an airport is how winds will impact operations. Wind direction and speeds are a critical component for calculating a pilot's ability to take off and land successfully. During the investigative phase of this project, we took a closer look at wind data from the airport's weather system, or AWOS, to determine if certain wind conditions hinder operations at the airport. After an analysis of over 120,000 weather observations, we determined that the current runway alignment is favorable for wind coverage and is adequate for the airport's operations. For reference, for our identified critical aircraft type, C2, which we will talk about in the forecast discussion, we try to ensure our wind coverage meets the threshold of 95% of the time. In our analysis, we determined in all three studied conditions, we are well above 99%. Land use in the vicinity of the airport can have an impact on the operations and growth potential. Since the airport receives AIP grant funding, the airport is obligated to ensure compatible land use around the airport. One way to ensure this compliance is by enacting airport zoning and proper land use planning. The city has enacted zoning for the airport to protect the airport as well as potential development around it. The city has zoned airport property as either I-1, shaded in pink, or I-2, shaded in dark pink, both of which allow a variety of uses ranging from manufacturing, agricultural, and commercial usage. Land adjacent to the airport has also been zoned as C2, shown in red. This provides commercial zoning opportunities, including hotels, car lots, and wholesale establishments, to name a few. The city also has identified an area of higher density residential use southeast of the airport. This R3 area, shaded in brown, allows for single-family homes, apartment complexes, and other community facilities. At the county level, Wasatch County has taken similar steps to protect county jurisdiction from incompatible land usage and has created an airport overlay zone which incorporates language related to specific building and land use regulations for safety and land use compatibility. Moving on to airport infrastructure, we utilize two terms for inventory: airside and landside facilities. At Heber Valley, we have one runway identified by a numerical value corresponding with heading. Runway 422 is a 6,898 by 75 feet asphalt runway surface with a rated weight bearing of 89,000 pounds for single wheel and 142,500 pounds for a dual wheel configured aircraft. Associated enhancements to the runway include non-precision instrument markings, medium intensity runway lights, MERLs for short, and a set of precision approach path indicators, or PAPIs. These enhancements provide additional visual cues for pilots utilizing the runway, especially at night and in poor weather conditions. Transitioning off the runway, we have a full-length parallel taxiway, known as Taxiway Alpha. Having a full-length parallel taxiway provides operational and safety improvements with faster exits from the runway to the apron or hangar areas. Another tool pilots have is called an Automated Weather Observation System, or AWOS. The AWOS is a set of instruments used to determine atmospheric conditions for pilots as they make their decision to operate at the airport. This system is accessible via phone and radio frequency. Regarding landside facilities, we determined there are currently 71 hangars divided into three main areas. Most of these hangars are privately owned, with a few owned by commercial developers or the city. The airport is surrounded with perimeter fencing formed using a mix of wildlife and chain link with barbed wire fencing. The public can access the airport via Airport Road to a public parking lot consisting of 21 marked spots. Users and staff can access inside the fence through multiple entry points around the airport, including using 3 control gates. As was previously mentioned, the airport is utilized by many entities, including private individuals. The airport is also home to a full-service business known in the aviation world as a fixed-based operator, or FBO. The FBO OK3 Air offers many services, including fuel, ground, and aircraft maintenance to pilots. At the southwest end of the hangar area is the Commemorative Air Force Hangar. This group restores and flies historic military aircraft for the purpose of honoring military aviation and providing educational opportunities to the public. Their hangar contains public access to educational displays, aircraft tours, and hosting private and public events. The most vital component to date is the research and publication of the draft forecast of aviation demand. Once completed and circulated for comment, this document will be reviewed by FAA staff before moving forward in the project. In this section, we will review terminology used in the forecasting process and beyond, industry-accepted methodology, aviation trends, documented aircraft use, the draft-based aircraft forecast, draft operations forecast, and the critical design aircraft. Just as a reminder, this is a big chapter, and for additional information and data citation, we recommend that you consult Chapter 4. To better understand forecasting methodology, I will share with you the details concerning the term Airport Reference Code, or ARC. The FAA developed the ARC as a coding system to assist in categorizing aircraft and applying the FAA airport design standards and facility development. The ARC is comprised of the Aircraft Approach Category, AAC, which categorizes an aircraft's approach speed by using the letters A through E. As a quick reference, A is the slowest approach speed and E is the fastest approach speed. In conjunction with the AAC, the Airplane Design Group, ADG, uses a combination of tail height and wingspan to group aircraft by Roman numerals 1 through 6. As a quick reference, Group 1 is utilized by the smallest sized aircraft through Group 6 for the largest. When we refer to the ARC, we utilize the combination of AAC and ADG, for example, B3. In developing the forecast, we use a variety of best practices to create a realistic forecast into 3 distinct projection ranges: short, mid, and long range, using the baseline year 2021. As we began reviewing data sources, we started by placing and reviewing motion-activated cameras that were set up in strategic locations at the airport. This data provides us photographic evidence of aircraft operating at the airport and is vital in cross-referencing with data collected by flight plans, UDOT and FAA forecast, the 5010 Airport Master Record Form, and data supplied by the airport's FBO. Using these data sources, we can apply socioeconomic data and compare with peer airports. Once this initial data is collected, we begin extrapolating information for a baseline year, in this case using 2021, and then begin developing the 20-year forecast period. At the macro level, we review national information to determine how Heber Valley will be impacted by forecasted trends. The latest FAA aerospace forecast is one such source we analyze. According to the FAA and industry experts, we will continue seeing a trend of piston aircraft being replaced by turbine aircraft, as the overall national aircraft inventory will decrease by 0.9% over the next 30 years. However, with less aircraft flying in the system, this will put more burden on existing aircraft, with an overall increase in the number of hours flown growing by 16% over the next 30 years. Moving on to pilot certifications, the ongoing discussions about pilot shortages will continue for the foreseeable future, even after COVID's impact on the global economy. National trends indicate that pilot certifications will decrease over the next 30 years. In particular, the number of active sport, private, and rotorcraft pilots will decrease, while the number of commercial and airline transport pilots will increase over the same time period. To give you a visual representation of how the ARC applies, we wanted to show how recorded aircraft at the airport can be radically different even within the same ARC classification. To begin, ARC A1 is depicted in the top left, bottom left, and top right images. While all three are A1, we have different configurations shown, including single-engine piston, multi-engine piston, and jet. Moving up in classification, the plot is PC-12, located in the bottom right, is a turboprop aircraft categorized as an A2 aircraft. Moving to slightly faster approach speeds, we begin to get into B1 aircraft, such as the Cessna 421, located at the top left. The other two aircraft are B2. The bottom left is a Cessna Citation jet, and on the right side is an Embraer Phenom jet. Once we get into Category C aircraft, these are mostly business jets. Our camera captured numerous AAC Category C aircraft, including the Learjet 60, a C1 aircraft located in the top left, a Challenger 600, a C2 aircraft located on the bottom left, a Challenger 350, a C2 aircraft located at the top right, and Gulfstream 5, a C3 aircraft, bottom right. At the end of the ARC spectrum, we captured a D2 aircraft, a Gulfstream 4 located in the top left. In addition, our cameras caught several aircraft outside of the realm of ARC. This includes the R-22 helicopter, bottom left, a gyroplane, top right, and a hot air balloon, bottom right on the left side of the photo. The first forecast we are examining is the based aircraft forecast. Based aircraft counts are based upon aircraft that are permanently stored at an airport. From a facility and infrastructure planning standpoint, it is crucial to understand our based aircraft count and how this will impact infrastructure demands throughout the planning period. For our forecast, we reviewed 3 growth rate scenarios. The first scenario was based upon the Utah State Aviation System Plan, which indicated a 0.6% annual growth rate. The second scenario was based upon population growth of Heber City as determined by the Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budget. The OMB forecasted a 1.3% annual growth rate through 2060. The last scenario utilizes the FAA's terminal area forecast and their annual growth rate of 2.4% annually. These 3 growth rate scenarios were compared as shown in the table. As you can see, the baseline year uses 84 aircraft, which was the number of aircraft found according to FAA records and our research. With the scenarios applied, you see 2041 numbers differ significantly from the 0.6% growth or 95 aircraft to the higher end of 2.4% or 135 aircraft. The OMB's growth rate was selected as the preferred methodology since the growth rate examined the longest planning period, 40 years, and was very similar to averaging the 3 scenarios' growth rates. This conservative approach captures the community's steadily increasing population and solid economic foundation. By applying this 1.3% growth rate, we go from 84 based aircraft in 2021 to 109 based aircraft by 2041. The next forecast we will discuss is the operations forecast. Operation counts are based upon an aircraft performing a takeoff or landing. Different factors will also impact the number of operations at an airport, including the primary type of flights. For example, visiting aircraft versus heavy flight training environments. The same methodology used in the based aircraft forecasting was applied to the operations forecasting. The first scenario was based upon the Utah SAS, which indicated a 0.6% annual growth rate. The second scenario was based upon population growth of Heber City as determined by the OMB's forecasted annual growth rate of 1.3% through 2060. The last scenario utilizes the FAA's TAF growth rate of 3%. It is of note that TAF's operational growth of 3% is slightly higher than the forecasted based aircraft growth rate previously discussed. These three growth rate scenarios were compared as shown in the chart. As you can see, the TAF's growth rate quickly overshadows the SASP and OMB's rates. Ultimately, the project team chose the OMB's growth rate as the preferred methodology since its growth rate examined the longest planning period, 40 years. It was very similar to averaging the three scenarios' growth rates. This conservative approach captures the community's steadily increasing population and solid economic foundation. By applying this 1.3% growth rate, we go from 10,194 operations in 2021 to 13,199 operations by 2041. If you break this down further, this equates to roughly 36 operations per day or 1.5 operations per hour based on the 2041 estimates. A further breakdown by ARC will now be discussed. When we complete the operations forecast, we examine our data sources to determine what the fleet mix is at the airport. This table located on the right side provides our forecasted operation numbers and applies the fleet mix percentages to ascertain the ARC operations at critical forecast years. Through comparing our forecasts with the information gathered in the forecasting process, we are very confident that C2 is the critical ARC today and through the entire forecasting period. To determine a critical ARC and subsequent critical design aircraft, we identify the aircraft which is the fastest and largest aircraft performing at least 500 annual operations at the airport and meets the FAA-defined regular use threshold. With our flight plan information and camera data alone, we captured well over 500 C2 operations. Using this data and knowing the critical ARC, we now can discuss the critical design aircraft. Talking about critical design aircraft, through our analysis, we have identified the Bombardier Challenger 350 as the existing and future critical design aircraft. This C2 aircraft was independently verified to be operating at the airport through FBO records, filed flight plans, and motion-activated cameras as seen in this image. C2 aircraft, such as the Challenger 350, is anticipated to grow from 740 operations in 2021 to 924 operations by 2041. In closing, the airport master plan process is long and methodical. It ensures that the airport sponsor gathers the necessary data and follows established methodologies and protocols. The FAA will review the forecast to ensure the methodology is sound and defensible. It may seem like at this time we can't answer all your questions about potential future impacts. And while that may be frustrating, please remember that each step is deliberate and part of this process. What I can say now is once the FAA reviews and approves our forecast and critical design aircraft, we will use these details to establish the facility requirements for the airport and then utilize all of our data to date to guide us in creating solutions during the alternatives process. Jeremy Mcallister will now discuss this in more detail during his presentation. If you have any questions about my slides, please email info@hebervalleyflightpath.com now. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Jeremy Mcallister, and I'm the project manager for this project. I'm also the main point of contact for the engineering and the planning that will occur at our airport. I say our airport because I'm a resident of Heber City along with my wife and 2 children. I'm also the office manager for the Heber City Office of TO Engineers. I want to take a few minutes this evening to go over the next steps that we hope to accomplish this year with respect to the master plan. Our goal is to make this process as transparent and clear as possible. So please note any questions you have throughout the recorded portion of my presentation, and I'll be happy to discuss those questions with you either tonight through the Flightpath website, or we can schedule a time to meet at my office or the airport. I'm here all the time, and I'm happy to sit down with you. For those of you who haven't already seen this, this is a revised project timeline for the remainder of the master plan update process. We've accomplished a lot, and now I'd like to talk to you about what we plan to accomplish in 2021. Tonight's meeting is public meeting number 2 and is the 3rd item on the top row of this flow chart. Our goal is to conduct 2 more public meetings and several committee meetings through the end of this year, ideally resulting in a draft of the recommended alternative for our airport. Once we get approval from the FAA on the forecast chapter, the next 2 steps in the master plan process are called the facility requirements and the alternatives development. These 2 steps, and especially the alternatives development, constitute those areas where community feedback will be most critical. I'll explain more throughout this presentation. It is expected to take around 1.5 months to 2 months to determine the facility requirements and more than 6 months to develop the alternatives. These are hugely important pieces of the process that can't be rushed. These chapters and the related meetings will take up the remainder of 2021. At this point in the master plan process, we have studied the socioeconomic factors in the region that are driving the demand at our airport. We have taken an inventory of the airport, including site conditions, terrain, wind coverage, based aircraft, all the physical facilities, grant history, and more. We are wrapping up the forecast effort that Jared discussed and will transition to the facility requirements after we receive approval from the FAA on our forecast methodology and conclusions. These building blocks will be essential as they allow us to quantify everything that we have, as well as the traffic the airport is getting and projected to get. In a nutshell, the facility requirements effort is an analysis to clearly define the aviation needs of the airport to accommodate the forecasted demand. As planners, we need to ensure that this process provides sufficient information to establish purpose and need for any proposed federal action. It is important to keep this step broad when defining the gaps between what the facility needs to accommodate the forecasted traffic and what the facility currently has. Using the information gathered in the process to date, we will use the findings to begin discussing alternatives that balance the airport's needs with the community's vision. Once this process has been vetted, the master plan process will narrow the focus down to a recommended alternative. To help planners better understand the existing and future facility requirements, it is typical to rely on interviews with airport management, airport tenants, airport business, and airport users. We don't consider the Heber Valley Airport or its master plan to be typical. So while those interviews have and will continue to take place, we've put a lot more emphasis on a wider net to capture more input and more diversity of thought. Our goal is that the airport serves the entire community as best as possible. The airport's strategic vision will guide the airport through the next 2 decades. There are 2 committees that are currently conducting analyses on the goals and features of what the Heber Valley Airport could be. One committee is focused on the community point of view and is comprised of a wide range of stakeholders, including local business leaders, leaders from neighboring communities outside of Heber City, locally elected officials, airport tenants, and airport board members. This committee is called the Community Advisory Committee, or CAC. The other committee is called the Technical Advisory Committee, or TAC. This committee includes airport management staff, city planning and zoning staff, airport board members, and on-site businesses. Both committees will provide their input throughout this process. In addition to the committees, we have the website up with the ability for anyone to submit comments, questions, or concerns. We have social media channels, we post blogs, videos, historical documents, and of course, we will be conducting public meetings throughout the life of this master plan process. Looking at a few facility requirement specifics, now that we have our critical aircraft and projected forecast, we will use that information to determine what the facility needs to look like in order to meet those requirements. For the Heber Valley Airport Master Plan, the major things we look at are much different at a general aviation facility than at a commercial service airport. Scheduled airline activities not being considered as part of this master plan effort because it's not in the city's vision for this airport, and the city has the power and authority to make that decision. As a result, we don't need to look at things like TSA security requirements, passenger terminal buildings, peak hour demands, or intermodal connectivity. The forecast does show that the type of aircraft utilizing the facility is exceeding the design safety standards that the current facility is designed to accommodate. This step of the master plan process will show the changes that need to be made to meet the facility requirements, including runway and taxiway requirements listed here. We will evaluate demand for aircraft storage facilities. Typically, demand for enclosed hangars are higher in our part of the country in comparison to lower elevation airports. A useful barometer of those facility needs, particularly short-term needs, is the existence of a waiting list for hangars. In Heber, we currently have a waiting list with about 200 names looking to either buy or rent hangar space or tie-down space on a ramp. We will carefully evaluate the existing and future general aviation aircraft fleet mix. For example, business jets have a different facility and service requirement than single-engine aircraft. Local or base traffic have different facility needs than itinerant traffic. These factors will shape the type of facilities needed, whether that be additional tie-down space, hangar development areas, fueling facilities, and access to and from the airfield, just to name a few. Northern airports have a more critical need of snow removal equipment. We will look at facilities for airport management, including administrative offices, maintenance needs, shop space, etc. The master plan should also address existing and future utility needs, such as water, sanitary sewer, and power supply. Those existing systems need to be evaluated and their capacities verified. As planners, we will evaluate how meeting these needs can provide revenue from these activities and improve the airport's overall financial position, and identify improvements that preserve or enhance the revenue-generating performance of the airport. The alternatives development effort brings together many different elements of the planning process to identify and evaluate ideas for meeting the needs of the various airport users, as well as the strategic vision of the airport sponsor. These alternatives should include balancing the competing needs among the airport's various functional elements. It should take into consideration any environmental issues in the identification, evaluation, and selection efforts. Although the master plan is not part of the NEPA process, this phase of the master plan can provide an important component of environmental analysis. Alternatives should also take into consideration fiscal issues, including the practical fiscal limitations of the FAA's ability to make grants available, as well as the sponsor's ability to provide match money to those grants. A plan must be realistic in terms of what can be funded to provide benefit to the sponsor and airport users. Please note, however, that cost alone is not necessarily a valid reason for rejecting an alternative. This means that we can't avoid an environmentally responsible alternative just to save money. There needs to be more justification, like another alternative with a smaller environmental impact, or a different approach to the alternative that reduces the environmental impact to an acceptable level. The identification of alternatives, evaluation, and selection process should be the most collaborative portion of the master plan study and must have an effective public involvement process. I'll explain more in the following slides. This slide is a simplified graphical representation of the alternative analysis process. And it's probably a good time for me
Oh my God.
to emphasize that these slides will be made available through the Heber Valley Flightpath website for people to view, as well as this presentation after the meeting. The alternative analysis process is iterative, and it's intended to be flexible to permit creative thinking about the future of the airport, but structured enough to consider all pertinent factors. A meaningful public involvement program will provide important stakeholder input throughout the process. The alternatives analysis process should start with a broad group of alternatives for the primary elements and progressively screen them to produce a reasonable number of alternatives that meet the planning needs. This is often generated by using a collaborative brainstorming approach, with the focus being on the primary elements. We will lean on our airport sponsor, our airport board, and our advisory committees heavily during the iterative process. Early work should consider a number of ideas, but these will be reduced to a manageable number of true alternative approaches through the initial steps of the process, taking care to adequately document what concepts were examined and why certain ones were dismissed. For Heber City, public meeting number 3 will be the time when the best cut of initial ideas come out of committees and are presented to the public for review and comments. So, what are primary and secondary elements? Typically, we view primary elements as functional or critical elements of the airport, like runways, safety areas, taxiways, etc. Primary elements require large adjacent tracts of land, whereas secondary elements have a greater flexibility and can often be subdivided and filled in around the primary elements. Secondary elements include items such as tie-down areas, hangar development areas, non-aeronautical use areas, and aircraft or airport maintenance facilities, for example. Steps 2 through 10 only consider those alternatives that meet the sponsor's planning need and that the FAA and airport sponsor will be able to implement. For ease of this presentation, I want to group steps 2 through 8 of this graphic into one big cycle. We will often jump back and forth between steps 2 and 8 as is appropriate, depending on the alternatives being considered. We do a qualitative analysis of the primary elements early in steps 2 and 3. Later, in step 5, we do a more quantitative analysis on the primary elements. Then we will perform a similar quantitative analysis at step 8 as we start to combine these elements into alternatives. With respect to qualitative data, this is where the strategic vision will be important. Qualitative data is typically non-statistical and unstructured. For example, do we as a community want to put a heavy emphasis on preserving open space? Do we want to limit geographic footprint to the bare minimum? How important is revenue generation and promoting local business? Quantitative data is more statistical and structured. How many hangars will this impact? What is the square footage of ramp space that will be lost by this choice? What environmental impacts will this alternative have? Step 9 of this graphic is labeled as the recommended alternative, but it is worth noting that this is only in consideration of those primary elements. Once we are collectively satisfied with the major or primary elements, we will then perform another round for the secondary elements. The result of this process will conclude at step 13, a refined recommended alternative that will become the Airport Layout Plan, or ALP. When evaluating alternatives, it is important that we adapt our approach to the airport's unique situation. The analysis should follow generally accepted planning practices, be consistently applied, and well documented. There's a great degree of subjectivity, so we must be careful to achieve a balanced evaluation while still being responsive to the various stakeholders' points of view. There are 4 broad criteria for evaluation: operational performance, best planning tenets, environmental factors, and fiscal factors. For ease of this presentation, I've combined environmental and fiscal factors. Now, this list is not all-inclusive, but does provide insight into the evaluation process. When referring to operational performance, we need to consider the performance of the primary elements and the combination of those elements. How well will the airport function as a system from several different perspectives? For example, will sliding the runway to the southwest away from town adversely impact the desire to limit additional navigation easements or land acquisition? As planners, we need to determine the relative strengths and weaknesses of the alternatives. The best planning tenets will apply evaluation criteria to the airport. Listed here are 9 items that we've identified as potentially important to consider, but there may be more, and they don't all carry the same weight in the evaluation process. We need to understand the condition of the airport, the business relationships between the airport and its tenants, the future vision of the airport sponsor, and other factors that make this airport unique. As mentioned previously, we must balance needs, oftentimes competing needs, among the airport's various functional elements. We must evaluate environmental and fiscal factors as listed here. Early consideration of environmental effects of the alternatives can help ensure that they remain responsive to the overall environmental objectives of the airport sponsor. If early estimates indicate that principal alternatives are beyond realistic fiscal capability of the airport, we will include that information in the master plan and develop more fiscally responsible alternatives. Ultimately, the goal is to arrive at a plan that the city approves and the FAA accepts. One point that is worth noting is the absence or lack of emphasis of the FAA participation throughout the alternative development process. Design standards are ever present during the consideration and evaluation of the alternatives, but this process is really accomplished at the local level. The airport sponsor will approve the airport layout plan, while the FAA's role is to accept the ALP, provided that the sponsor has gone through the process outlined in this presentation. This will not be the FAA's plan. This will not be TO Engineers' plan. This will be the Heber Valley Airport and Heber City's plan. Let me end by saying that we are committed to continue every effort to be accurate, timely, transparent, and available throughout the process. We have covered a lot of information in a short period of time. Please be aware that we will be providing links to this information and much more on the Heber Valley Flightpath website. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jared and Jeremy for the presentations. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of process, and it's a lot to process all at once. But I do think it's so important that the team is able to show where the data comes from, how it was compiled, the types of methodologies and best practices that they used to establish the forecast that will guide this plan moving forward. And so thank you both for your time and your insight. And for more insight, we are turning to the live portion of our presentations with the Q&A. We got a steady stream of questions coming in during those presentations, and I thank all of you who've reached out for them. Please continue to do so by emailing info@hebervalleyflightpath.com or using the Contact Us button on our website. There are several panelists who will be joining us here, and allow me to just introduce them quickly. First is Heber City Mayor Colleen Potter. Colleen has been involved in planning and decision-making for Heber City Airport for the last 7 years, first as a city council member and then currently as mayor. Matt Brower is our city manager, having more than 24 years of experience serving as a city manager for local governments in California, Florida, Georgia, and Utah. In his capacity as city manager, he's overseen the management of the Ocala International Airport, Lincoln Regional, and now Heber Valley. Travis Biggs is the airport manager. He graduated from UVU in airport management and has a master's degree in public administration from BYU. Before serving at the airport, he was a business owner and a volunteer firefighter and lives with his wife and 4 children here in Heber. We've got our project team members from TO Engineering, starting with Jared Wingo as the aviation planning manager for TO Engineers since June 2020, handling the technical and personnel aspects of the master plan process. Before joining TO, Jared previously worked at the state and federal levels and in the private sector. Jared has a master's and bachelor's degree in aviation and currently holds a commercial pilot certificate. And Jeremy McCall, sounds like we're gonna be muted there. Our TO engineer project manager for Heber Valley is Jeremy Mcallister, a professional engineer and also the office manager for the Heber City office for TO. He's been working exclusively in aviation for 12 years and has lived in Heber City for 7 years. The next on our list is our attorney, Peter Kirsch. Peter Kirsch is a partner with the law firm of Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell. For more than 30 years, he's represented airports and communities with airport development projects with a particular focus on master planning and addressing community impacts. He works with the FAA, airport sponsors, communities, and airport users to find solutions that allow airports to prosper without damaging their neighbors, and in the process, represents clients in negotiation, litigation, and transactions. He lives in Colorado and splits his time between there and DC. Finally, we have our Airport Advisory Board Chair, Jason Talley. Jason is the chairman of the Heber City Airport Advisory Board, and in this role has tried to ensure airport self-sufficiency and to be responsive to the community. He's the CEO of Baker's Burgers Incorporated, a fast food restaurant chain with 40 locations and over 1,300 employees. In addition, he owns several technology companies focused on aviation. He is an active pilot with aircraft operated out of Heber, and he uses aviation in his work as well as enjoying it with his wife and 2 boys. Thank you all for joining again. This is our team for the panel. We will go ahead and start this process with the questions that we have submitted, or that have been submitted earlier in the plan. We asked for the committee and the community members to submit their questions ahead of time. And so we do have 15 that came in before the meeting, as well as all of the comments that are continuing to come in by sending emails to info@hebervalleyflightpath.com. So we'll start with a Q&A, and we'll continue to update these questions as you send them in. Remember, the panel is here all night to answer your questions if need be. We'll try to be respectful of duplications and repetition, but we do want to make sure that your questions and comments are heard. Why don't we start with the first question. Why do there need to be any changes made to Heber Valley Airport? And I don't know, Mayor Potter, if you would like to take this.
You bet, I'll jump in here. As you've seen from what we just heard, there's increasing traffic here at our airport, and the FAA requires us, through the grant assurances that we've made previously when we've accepted federal money, to meet the safety requirements for the airplanes that are landing here. So as we look to the future and say, who's coming here today, who do we expect to come, there are certain standards that we are expected to keep as part of the assurances that we've made when we've accepted that funding and to continue to receive funding from the federal government.
Thank you. And does anybody else in the panel like to jump in? I want to keep it as open as possible, so please don't hesitate if you want to continue on someone else's point. Okay. The second question that our first respondent had is specifically, who is advocating for these upgrades?
I can follow up with that one. There's not really any person in particular, but part of this process that we're doing is a requirement of the FAA. It's kind of like a business plan. And when we do this business plan and see that our numbers fit into a new category, that is essentially an FAA guideline or requirement that encouraging us to change our standard and upgrade the safety requirements of the airport.
Thank you.
I'll add just a little bit to that, Katie, as well. I work at a lot of different airports, and it's standard that the airports update their master plan a minimum of every 7 to 10 years. Oftentimes, they'll update them more if there's a change or a radical change or a big project that was just completed. There'll be a master plan update following that. But if nothing has changed, usually 7 to 10 years is as long as you want to go on the master plan. Currently, Heber City's master plan is 16 years old.
Katie, this is Matt. I might offer this. The question says, who is advocating? I think the mayor's right. I don't think anyone's advocating for this, but we do have, like the mayor said, grant assurances that we have to comply with. And those grant assurances come about because of contracts that we have agreed to repeatedly over the last 40+ years. But we work with a lot of aviation planners out of what they call the airport district office in Colorado. And we work with them quite closely on this plan in terms of asking questions and getting feedback through the process.
Thank you. Okay, now, can one of our panel members please quantify the current economic impact on business in the Valley for the airport?
When we looked at the master plan, what we really focused on was reviewing information that was readily available. So for our case, what we did was we reviewed state aviation system data provided by UDOT. As we alluded to in the presentation, that data is dated, and the state is currently underway to update the information in that study. We've talked to UDOT. We should be updating the overall economic impact information that will be provided to the airport hopefully soon. But through our analysis and reviewing the 2004 data, what we have shown is there's a roughly $8 million impact at the airport based on 2004 dollars. And when we do a simple CPI inflation of those dollars, we're in that $11 million range in regards to payroll, services, and any indirect economic impacts.
11 million. Thank you. That's a good number, and I think it'll be important that we continue to update that when more information is available.
I would add, Katie, a lot of people ask about people flying in here and if they're all going other places and all that. I know regardless of where the people are going, that are passengers, the pilots all stay here in the valley. And if you go talk to any of the hotels, they'll tell you there's hundreds and hundreds of pilots staying at our hotels here. And then they're eating at our restaurants and recreating. So it's difficult to have an exact number because you can't follow everybody around, but it'll be interesting to see what the UDOT comes up with their updated study.
And to kind of follow up on Travis there, when we talk about direct and indirect impacts, a direct impact would be, for example, the FBO and their staff, that payroll transactions. When we talk about indirect impacts, we're talking about, that FBO staff member going out into the community at the grocery store or gas station or whatever the case may be, and spending their paycheck in the community or spending it in Park City, or vice versa. When somebody comes in, goes to Park City, and then an employee at Park City comes home back to Heber City, those dollars are being connected through not only the community but also the region. So I just wanted to highlight that difference and that trickle down economics and their impact on the airport.
I think also they track taxis and catering services and food deliveries and recreation and all sorts of other things. So it is interesting how they do economic studies, but there's a lot of people, a lot of the pilots fly for business. Jason, you might be able to expand on that a little bit, but I know a lot of our pilots use their airplanes to go to meetings and to go to other places. And it's, they use it as part of their business quite often.
Yeah, I think that's a one way to look at it, which is but for the airport, I wouldn't be able to do what I do, and I know that that's true for a lot of people that are using the airport, and we try to spread that economic impact. As Travis said earlier, it's not just the direct economic impact, but the city is a beneficiary of that. From the fuel flowage to the fuel to the maintenance to having people work on the aircraft, and then also just being able to be based in a community that has an airport. There's tax revenue that comes from that. I mean it's exhaustive, but at the end of the day, those of us that are using the airport and based here, very respectful of the community that we live in.
And Katie, sorry to pause here. Before we go any further, we got our introductions, but do you mind introducing yourself to the group?
Sure. I'm Katie Franco. I'm part of Aviatrix Communications, and me along with my cohort Cheryl, whose mouse you can see and whose questions she's compiling. We're helping with communications efforts for the airport master plan. And so we designed the website, we update the blog, we share posts on social media, help organize the meetings, and make sure that the community receives the information about the project as soon as it's available, and it's readily transparent and accessible for everyone. So thanks for that. Let's move to the next question, which was submitted earlier this week from info@hebervalleyflightpath.com. And I do ask, again, those who are not on the panel to please mic themselves so we can minimize background noise. And speaking of noise, what are the mitigation plans to offset noise, air pollution, reduce quality of life, and safety?
Sure. Jared and I, we can probably take that one. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. We definitely looked and discussed the potential environmental impact during the alternative phase of the master plan. It's not a NEPA process, but we do look at big environmental factors initially when we're considering all of the different alternatives. Things that we're looking at, I would call like showstoppers. We're obviously not going to reroute a river to accommodate a taxiway, things like that, big environmental impact. I think what is more, maybe more important, or the genesis of this question is kind of the noise impacts or potential noise impacts. And we also do noise contour studies. We will do those when we get further into the alternatives and have refined those alternatives down to the recommended alternative. We'll look at what the existing noise impacts are, what the future noise impacts would be with the forecasted traffic for both the existing alignment of the runway, and then if the alternative option is to show a shifted alignment, we would look at those impacts as well. Jared, did I cover that?
If I could add one point, I think it's really to keep the distinction in mind between the master plan and the implementation of the master plan. As Jeremy described, the master plan will evaluate and report on significant environmental impacts. But before Heber City can begin to implement the master plan, it must go through a thorough environmental review by the FAA in cooperation with the city. And that environmental review will require mitigation of certain categories of impacts if they are found to exist, things like noise, things like environmental impacts on the local community. That process, called an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, doesn't get started until after the master plan has been completed and when the city is beginning to consider implementing either all or parts or pieces of the master plan itself.
The other, hey, Katie, one of the things that I think is important to discuss about when we talk about noise, because I know that noise is a concern in the community, and I certainly can appreciate that. We have a voluntary noise abatement program that we try to ask every pilot to utilize. It's something that all of the local pilots that are based at Heber seem to do a very good job at following. We're also working with the FAA at the airport to try to have a departure on runway 22 for a lot of the transient jets that are coming in, which will reduce that takeoff noise as they're going over the city. And we're also working on different landing patterns for those aircraft that are coming in that aren't familiar with the airport and don't know how to fly over it. So we're actively working on that, even outside of this master plan, to try to reduce any noise impact in the community. And we think we'll have some results to show from that over the next couple of months.
Another thing we've been doing when it's talking about pollution, one of the city council members asked us a couple of years ago actually to install a device that you can go to purpleair.com, and there's some of these readers throughout the city, and it shows you how many particulates are in the air and where more pollution is compared to other spots. The airport typically is slightly lower than most of the rest of the valley, and they're pretty sensitive. Even if you drive by it, in a tractor or with a car, you'll see a spike in it. So that's good that we have that as well. So that's something that anyone in the community can go check at any time. Purpleair.com. Happy to show people if they're at the airport. I can show them around.
And to add on to Jason there too, Travis and I were just having a conversation earlier today about some feedback we've received in our meetings with the CAC and the TAC folks about that voluntary noise abatement procedures. And Travis and I will work on ways to get that information out for pilots that may not be in the local connection. And that way, when pilots are coming into Heber, they'll have a reference to go to get on the city website and look at that voluntary abatement procedure.
Thank you. And we will add a link to some of those voluntary noise abatement procedures, as well as the purpleair.com feature onto our website at hebervalleyflightpath.com. So after the meeting, you can go ahead and take a look at those at your leisure.
Katie, do we want to go over that? We've got more questions about that noise abatement. People ask why we don't make it mandatory instead of just voluntary. I don't know, Peter, if you want to expand on that, or my understanding is since the early 80s, no airports are allowed to, you can't enforce anything. It's just a a thing that you ask the pilots to please be respectful. But I don't know.
That's right. That's right, Travis. I think it's important to dispel a couple of misunderstandings here. When an aircraft is in the air, it is exclusively under the jurisdiction of the FAA. I can't tell them where to fly. Travis can't tell them where to fly. Matt can't tell them where to fly. Colleen can't tell them where to fly. It is entirely up to the FAA. Now, that being said, the FAA and pilots groups are always eager to be good neighbors. And I'm sure Jason can talk about this as well as a resident and as a neighbor and as a pilot. Many, many communities work closely with the FAA and with local pilots organizations to try to minimize the noise from takeoff and landings. And these voluntary programs can be really very successful because, to be perfectly frank, most pilots don't desire to make more noise to the community. Most pilots don't desire to create impacts. And if they understand, particularly the transient pilots, if they understand how they could fly in a way that will minimize the impacts to the community, our experiences around the country is the degree of cooperation is really quite extraordinary. Most people comply. And so it's working out those voluntary procedures that's so important in a community to make sure that pilots minimize the amount of noise they create from their operations.
I think that, you know, Peter, you said it very well, and hopefully I alluded to it earlier. We want to keep our noise footprint as small as possible. And on the airport board, we're working hard to make sure that people that utilize the airport understand that. And again, part of that's just communication. And, you know, we expect to see some tangible results on some of that over the next several months.
And I think it's important that we really reiterate our local pilots, our FBO, the city, we're all very much, we want to do all that we can to mitigate noise. Everyone agrees on that.
And Travis, some of those methods to mitigate noise, it's not just about how early or late you take off. There are different engine run-up opportunities and ideas. Are there anything else that you'd like to mention to the group about other measures that pilots can take beyond knowing what time it is before they take off and land?
Most pilots know, I think, especially the local ones that know sensitive areas. I believe the FBO and a lot of our local pilots, if they have to do a run-up or something with their engines, they'll deliberately point it in a direction to where it's kind of going into our buildings at the airport or somewhere where it's less invasive on other people.
From our experience at Heber and at other airports, most of the most serious noise problems are quite frankly caused by ignorance. They're caused by pilots not knowing the community, not knowing how they should fly to minimize impacts. And that's why the education of the pilot community is so important. The FBO is really important in this regard, as is the airport director and local pilots associations. And they are generally very successful because, again, the more they educate not just local pilots, but transient pilots, the more they're able to fly sensitively, to fly as good neighbors.
As I tell Travis, the loudest airplane I've ever heard coming off of the Heber airport is the DNR airplane that's stocked full of fish to go drop them into Uintas, and it's, you know, heavily weighted and it's just screaming and can barely climb. So that's, you know, not much we can do about that if we want to have fish in our lakes.
Yeah, and most of the locals, when they call, and I'm glad when they do, because I can explain usually if they call quickly after a plane takes off. Usually it is something like that. After the fires, they were flying up to reseed, and when they're heavily loaded like that, the engine's at full throttle, they're low, it's early in the morning, they have to do it when it's cool. So usually there's a pretty good reason for some of those. And then the helicopters, the military is required, they've 600 of these of the National Guard pilots that have to get some amount of hours. They try to spread out where they do their training, but they end up having to be here. They have to do night ops because they have night goggles. But most people explain it and they understand that it's not going to be an everyday thing, or are pretty understanding of that.
Thank you. I think Matt, you wanted to weigh in?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Checking. Great. Thank you for addressing some of the noise issues. And it looks like there are a couple questions on here that are related to funding of the master plan, of the upgrade, and perhaps airport expansion. So is it true the city will fund $2 million of upgrade costs?
So let me maybe make a stab at this. So I have seen that number on social media. I've seen that number actually used in an op-ed or a letter to the editor, I think last week, the week before. And I truly have no idea where that $2 million comes from. As it was indicated earlier, the facilities requirement of the master planning process is yet to commence. We really don't know what the costs are going to be for meeting the standard requirement for C2 aircraft. And so I don't know where that number comes from. However, there will likely be cost to meet the standards, and the FAA generally covers 95% of those costs. Heber City, the airport, will cover that remaining 5%. And again, that will be covered by the users at the airport. There will be no general tax dollars that will be allocated for that purpose.
And I believe, Matt, hasn't the airport been self-sufficient between federal and state funding, as well as what the users at the airport, the people that are paying rent there, the tenants, the fuel flowage are paying?
That is correct. The airport's budget is balanced without using general obligation funds. It is balanced using user fees, whether it's a fuel flowage fee, whether it is a hangar fee, or whether it's a landing fee. The airport is self-sufficient, and we hope as a city to keep it that way.
Thank you. And to tack on to that, can you talk about the airport dollars? And when one of our submissions asks, why would we put money into an airport when we can put it into something like affordable housing? Are there rules that are tied to airport money?
It's really very important to understand how airport money can be used. Well, we use the phrase closed fiscal system. What that means is that all money that is earned on the airport by the city must be spent on the airport by the city. And all the other money, for example, that Matt talked about for funding any capital costs, money from the FAA, can only be used for the airport, and that's by law. And so airports generally are self-sufficient in most communities, and they set their fees, they set their charges so that they can break even. They're not profit-making entities, they're government entities. And so they set fees in a way that allows them to be self-sufficient. And the reason that FAA funding is so important is that the cost of capital projects, things like runways and taxiways and improvements, are so great that it's very difficult for individual users to be able to have fees high enough to pay for those. And as a result, the federal government provides grants for these. But it's really important to understand that the community doesn't subsidize the airport, and the airport doesn't subsidize the community. These are really entirely separate pots of money.
Thank you so much. We can turn a little bit to perhaps the users on the airport, and it's a pretty common sentiment among the comments that we've received over this project. What percentage of the total users are coming from Summit Valley or Summit County or elsewhere in the Valley, and who are local users? Can you talk a little bit about who uses the airport, and is there any kind of data behind it, Travis?
So we just upgraded our gate access system, and so part of that, we get people's addresses so that we can contact them or send them bills and that kind of thing. So the ones that use our airport a lot, that are here enough that they have access, it's about 34% in Summit County, 34% Wasatch County. Then you've got 10 or 15% from out of state. So we assume those are kind of secondary homes, stuff like that here. About the same in Salt Lake, and then a couple from other counties. When you look at the hangar owners and the aircraft owners, it's about the same. It's 45%, I think, from of those counties, and then the rest from other places. Knowing some of the questions asked, where these people are going, where they're coming from, that's a little difficult. To figure out where the aircraft is coming from is fairly simple. We can see where they came from, we can see where they're going, especially if they file a flight plan. But knowing who is on that aircraft or where their home is or what house they're visiting, that's a little more difficult. Like I said before, it's some of the new growth here. As we've seen higher end housing grow in the valley, we've seen more demand trending towards Wasatch, but there's still, I'd say, probably about half going to Summit. And then, like I say, when you say where are these people coming and going, the pilots are all going here for almost the whole part, and the rest is a guess, but about half and half is what we think.
Excellent. Thank you. I think, and can you talk next about, there's a question down here on plans to keep the airport available to small planes with more or replaced small hangar options?
I can speak just a little bit about that because we've had some proposals recently through the Airport Advisory Board that were forwarded up to the City Council to build some more hangars, what we call T hangars, for the smaller aircraft. And I know that the City Council has worked with that and has entered into some discussions regarding that, and I believe some options on that, pending the outcome of the master plan, right? Because you don't want to go put a large investment in hangars in only to find out that they need to be moved because of one of the options that the airport has to consider during the master plan. So I think there's been a lot of discussion on that. There's been a lot of movement on that, and I hope that as part of this master plan, as somebody that uses the airport, will be looking at that, because that generates local construction jobs and also a large tax revenue for the county and the city just on the property side. So we have been working on that. The master plan kind of made everything go into a standstill for a while, but hopefully we'll get this finalized.
Thank you. We've got a question come in just now about additional hangars and what will happen to Hangar Row. Is that something where it's too soon to talk about in the process, or something that we could address right now?
I'll start that one off. So there was a master plan study done back in 03 and 04, and it's uploaded to the website if anybody wants to read it. And that recommended alternative did show the runway shifting away from the highway. And one of the results of that was in the recommendation was to remove Hangar Row, which, for those who don't know what Hangar Row is, it's 31 common wall hangars that house a lot of the smaller planes. So that was recommended back in 03 and 04. That is not our recommendation today. We haven't got to that recommendation. So my answer as a planner is, we're not going to predetermine the outcome of what is going to occur to the runway, but we will eventually get to that, and it'll be during that alternatives development phase.
I think also to add to that, to what Jeremy was saying, that my understanding is even after everything is decided, whatever ends up being the decision, any actual project or moving of dirt or anything like that is years down the road. It's not anywhere near. So we'll have lots of time to be able to plan that sort of thing out, decide, go to those hangar owners and those pilots and say, if this does happen, what would you be looking for? And that will, I assume, is going to be part of this airport layout plan to determine kind of what the demand is and where that's going.
Absolutely. I mean, that demand will be paramount when we're looking at those alternatives. And if there's a displacement of existing structures or hangar owners, that always gets included in terms of providing space or, creating an option that provides space for those users.
And it'll be important, I think, to find out, some of them are just going to want the least expensive thing they can get that will house their aircraft. Others will say, I want the same size or maybe a little bit bigger. So everyone's going to have a different desire or intention. So that'll all have to be visited. But until we know how much space we have and where we want to put them and what kind, or, you know, then it's kind of difficult to make any plans for that sort of thing.
Katie, this is Matt. Can we back up? There's a question I think we jumped over. I think it was number 11 or 12. It's a really important one. I think we want to spend just a moment on. The question was relating to, let me find it here really quick. It is relating to, I don't remember what number it is, but relating to why can't the community vote on this? Why don't they have a say in this? And the reality is this is not a legislative decision. The decision to have an airport was made back in the late 1940s, early 1950s. This is a contractual issue. The city has with the FAA. As I've indicated earlier, the city has agreed to repeatedly contracts with the FAA in exchange for grants. And those contracts have very specific requirements in them that require the city to comply with standards and regulations and all sorts of things like that. So although this is not a legislative decision necessarily, the master planning process is a very public and very transparent process, as we talked about earlier. And in the phases coming up, there will be a number of opportunities for the public to get involved in the alternatives analysis, for example. And I'd recommend strongly that people stay involved and stay engaged in this process, because your voice will have a chance to be heard and you'll have a chance to be at the table and talk more about the alternatives analysis.
Maybe you could just explain a little bit more as well, Peter, because I hear this on from some of the community as well. Why we can't just elect to ignore the potential findings that we have, the requisite C2 traffic. We did that before. Why can't we do it again? You know, I think it would be helpful to kind of talk about that from a legal standpoint and what we risk by doing something like that or trying to do something like that.
I think that's a very good question, Jason. And without giving a long speech on airport law, let me try to give a short answer here. First of all, when the city took federal grants, as it has done for decades, it agrees to a number of conditions on those grants, which carry with them a lot of federal regulation, FAA regulation. The city is required to do a couple of things that seriously affect where this master plan goes. Number one, they are required to keep the airport safe. It is safe today. It will be safe tomorrow. One of those components of making it safe is that the city is required to accommodate the aircraft and the aircraft users who desire to use the airport. And what the master plan study is showing, what the forecast is showing, is that the size of aircraft that want to use this airport are somewhat larger than the current facilities would suggest meet optimum safety requirements. And so therefore, the city is required under the terms of its grant agreements with the FAA to bring the airport up to the requirements that are mandated by current safety standards. It's a little bit like if you build a home and you do a little renovation, you don't have to bring all the rest of your home up to code. But if you tear your house down to the walls and you want to rebuild it, why, you have to bring it up to code. Think of it as like the building code. Now, there is a question, well, how about if we tell the FAA, we don't want your money, you can keep your money. We're going to do this airport the way we want to. And that sounds very nice in an abstract way, but it doesn't work that way for a couple of reasons. One is, once you take a federal grant, when you take that federal grant, the city signs a contract that says we will comply with federal conditions for 20 years after this grant. So if today you were to stop taking federal money, then in 2041, you would be free of FAA regulation, but you'd have to agree not to take money during those 20 years. And during those 20 years, you would still be obligated to keep the airport safe and to make necessary improvements to keep it safe. Why, for example, the kinds of money the FAA gives you grants for, capital project and so on, that money wouldn't come for 20 years. You'd have to find other sources for that funding. And so it is really not practical for an airport to say, we don't want to take federal money anymore. We want to instead just be locally controlled. Now, it's fair to say there are a small handful, 2 or 3 or 4 airports around the country who have embarked on a 20-year plan to stop taking federal money. And those are very difficult plans. They are very, very, very expensive plans. And most of them fail. Now and then a community actually goes through the full 20 years of not taking federal money. But the principle that the FAA uses, which is a good one, which is that when the FAA invests money in your airport, they want to make sure that you are maintaining that airport in a safe manner. And so the city is required to do so, whether it takes money now or whether it takes money for the next 19 years, it is obligated to do so.
And Peter, I would like to just make one comment on that, because it's something that I've seen on Ask Heber, which I know as soon as I see something about the airport, I probably shouldn't read it, but I have been, I just haven't responded to them, which is when a pilot is landing, if the airport's not safe for them because they're operating a C2 airplane, why do they continue to land? And it's important to understand that as a pilot, we're not looking at, you know, what the distance between the runway and a taxiway and other structures are. We're looking at things like wind direction to make sure that we can land on a runway that's got a good wind component, and that the runway is long enough, as well as, you know, maybe it doesn't have ice or rain on it. We assume, and the FAA wants us to assume, that all of the other safety considerations are taken care of, right? So we don't even have a way to look at some of these other things. And in fact, if some of those safety considerations aren't there, there's reporting, you know, if you have a tower with a light out, or if you have an obstruction like a bulldozer near the runway. So we don't get to make that determination of whether the facility is safe. We just have to assume that it is, which is why I think the FAA pushes on this so hard. So I just want everybody to understand, it's not a simple fact of a pilot saying, hey, it's not, I don't think the airport's safe. We're just not looking at the criteria that the FAA is looking at, much like you assume a road is safe at a certain speed when you see a sign that says, you know, 35 around a curve. There's guardrails there.
Yes, you're absolutely right on those points. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that the standards that Jason has talked about apply to private pilots, to general aviation. Commercial airlines are under a whole separate regulatory scheme. And one of the many reasons, and there's a long list, commercial airlines wouldn't be able to use this airport because of the facilities that are available here. And they are subject to different requirements that do require them to look at what the facilities are at the airport before they land.
Peter, this is Matt. I just prompted a question. Why can't Heber take on the FAA like Santa Monica did and win?
Well, you can. It costs Santa Monica many, many millions of dollars. Santa Monica has been in this fight for about 20, I'd say 25, 28 years. And they had lots of losses. They had lots of wins. It was long litigation. And at the end of the day, they were able to do what they did because they waited this out and fought this continually for many, many, many years. If Heber City wanted to do that, that's great. But it's a lot of money and a lot of uncertainty. And you use Santa Monica as an example, and I can probably give you a list 10 times as long of airports that haven't been successful in these efforts. So it is not by any means a surefire way, even if today the city were to say, we want to get into a Santa Monica type battle.
So Peter, that would be money outside of airport revenues they had to use for those legal battles? Or is that what you're saying, is that it was more money than?
Yeah, as a practical matter, Mayor, where are you going to find another $5 million, another $10 million from the airport users? It's just not going to happen. One of the things, and people may say, well, just raise the landing fees. Well, why don't we just raise the fuel flowage fee? It doesn't work that way, because under federal law, your rates and charges have to be reasonable. So the reasonable means based upon the kind of airport and the competition you have. And you couldn't just go out tomorrow and raise your fees by 10 times. You couldn't go out and raise your fuel flowage fees by 20 times in order to pay for that kind of litigation. And you're absolutely right, Mayor. In the case of Santa Monica, almost all of that money came from the general fund. Santa Monica is a very large city. It is, to be a bit blunt about it, they're a very wealthy city. And so their ability to fund this battle for 25 years is very different than a city like Heber City.
Thank you, Peter. That was really helpful. And we did have someone submit a question directly bringing up the Santa Monica as a case study and whether the Heber city would be interested in following the same path. Thank you for laying out exactly what that path was.
Peter, do we know if did they use federal funds to buy property for an airport, or was it just other things? I've heard that that's different. I've heard that.
Let's put it this way: Santa Monica is really complicated. I only worked on Santa Monica for about 10 years. That is less than half of the battle I worked for Santa Monica. And yes, there are all kinds of property acquisitions. At the end of the day, by the way, Santa Monica has been able to close their airport because they entered into a settlement agreement with the FAA a number of years ago, resolving all of this litigation, all of the battles. If they hadn't, they would still be in litigation today. So yes, Travis, you're right. There are a lot of uncertainties. There are a lot of things about Santa Monica that are unique. And to be perfectly blunt about it, if that's the direction the city wants to go, that's fine. But with no disrespect looking around the room here, I suspect most of us will be gone by the time that decision could really be realized.
Thank you. There's a question here, number 26, about working beyond the airport's current footprint. And will our safety efforts and mandatory upgrades require us to expand our footprint or to acquire land in other ways?
At the end of the master plan process, one of the questions will be whether the city wants to acquire additional land, and that's certainly going to be an important consideration going forward at the end of the master plan process. But I think it's way premature to talk about whether additional land should be, would be, will be purchased. We're nowhere near that kind of decision yet.
Agree, and I would just add that's really going to be a local priority and a local conversation that the community and the community at large get to engage in.
Yeah, and let me mention one other issue that I think is important as long as you raise the issue of land acquisition, and that is that I talked a lot about grant assurances and the requirements that airports comply with their contract with the federal government for 20 years. There's one important exception to that. If the city uses any federal money to purchase land, the requirements of federal law apply in perpetuity. Let me say that again. If the city uses any federal money to purchase land, the requirements of federal law apply in perpetuity. The city has used federal money to purchase land for this airport. And so going back in part to the Santa Monica question, like as I say, we could spend the whole evening on Santa Monica. I don't want anybody to leave this conversation with a sense that that this is an easy path, that this is a path that has a straightforward way to get there, or even that it is feasible for a city like Heber City.
I was going to add, we do have a table with all of the grant history from the airport. I think it's in Chapter 2 of the draft master plan that's available on the website. It'll show all of the grants that were taken for land acquisition or other things. I think there were 12 land acquisition grants taken between 1989 and 2005. And then there was one more land acquisition grant taken in 2016, the Maverick property, if you guys recall that. But so the whole list of those grants are available if anybody is interested in seeing them.
Thanks, Jeremy. Take a pause here. Thank the people who've continued to submit questions to info@hebervalleyflightpath.com. We are compiling and will continue to address them. But if you've got more questions, keep them coming. We're here to answer them. Matt, yes.
This is Jason. I'm looking through some of these questions here, and as we start to go into the next phase of, things that we're looking at and possibilities for the airport, I hope we take a lot of these questions because they look like they're leading questions about things that people would like to do, especially users at the airport, and can also include that in some of the considerations that we're talking about. And because obviously some of these questions we won't be able to say, yes, we want to do that, no, we don't, but these are obviously things that people are wanting to do, and so they need to be included in that section.
Absolutely. All of our comments are being compiled and recorded for the public record, and it is, as you said, an excellent way to find the nuggets and ideas the community would like to see for their airport in the next 20 years, and we'll be able to include those as we develop those alternatives.
And to add on to Jason there, I think if you scroll up to question, I believe 16, talking about glider operations, that keep going up. It's at the bottom of the page. Question 15. That's something that we received a comment earlier today, and when we talk about a draft document, it's a living document in the sense that we need to go back and look at our glider operations. Our staff has already contacted the Soaring Association and the Glider Club at Heber, and we'll be working with those folks and ensuring that their voice is heard. And they've talked about, they use a specific taxiway for their launching operations and recoveries. So again, everybody's comments, the public's comments are highly valued in our process, and we will address each and individual question. And if there's changes that need to occur, we'll take care of it before we submit it to the FAA.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jared. We do have, the airport was saved basically by the glider pilots at one point. They've got a really neat history. We get people all the time that come and say, hey, I used to take glider rides. Do you still do them? And we've got almost 20 gliders, I think, at our airport. They do 400 operations a year. It really is a neat, unique part of the airport. So I'm glad that we're able to get that in there and include that in the master plan process.
Absolutely. If nobody's ever tried it, that's a great experience to be introduced to aviation.
Thank you. It's now on my to-do list. Cheryl, have there been any questions up on that first page that we haven't directly talked about? I think we did talk about plans to limit hours of operation in terms of noise curfews or open access. But are there any?
And Katie, I can answer that question because it's very simple. Federal law does not allow an airport to limit its hours of operation. It certainly can work cooperatively with the users to try to limit operations at certain times of day, but you can't close an airport any more than you can close Route 40 or any other road to the city.
And it's important to note that the FBO has limited hours of operations, and it's very expensive if you're a out-of-town aircraft that's coming in and say landing at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night to get fuel, or if you're taking off at 6 in the morning. It's financially fairly prohibitive for things like that. What about the thrust reverse or the reverse question that's asked on there, Jeremy?
Yeah, there's a question about limiting thrust reverse. I don't see the number. We got that question in late, and I don't have an answer for that yet, but we've taken the question down, and we will address the question.
That question is also addressed in the noise abatement procedure. It talks a little bit about that as well.
I see one there. When is the completion of the master plan expected, and when will the decision on airport classification be made? Jeremy, I think you talked about those in your timeline.
Yeah, I did. So our timeline really got blown up with COVID, and we would have expected to be a lot further today than we are, just to be honest. So we've updated that timeline. We've made it available. I'm drawing a blank probably because I'm nervous being on the call, but we do show that timeline, and I believe we're hoping to finish in the spring or summer of 2022. with the master plan. The big question is the public involvement, and specifically that alternatives development that we discussed. We've blocked out a big chunk of time for that, and that's a guess, our best guess on how long that will take. But I want to stress that it's important that we get it right. So we want to allow enough time for that to occur, and we don't want to rush that process. Hopefully towards the spring or summer of 2022, but really we want to make sure that we take the time to take into consideration all of the factors, and there are a lot of them.
And to follow up on that, go ahead, Travis.
Go ahead and finish it. I got a different topic.
Okay, and then going on to that second part, that critical aircraft determination, I think it was the question right below that, or airport classification. What'll happen is, just like I just mentioned previously about the glider operations, if there's anything else that may not be properly addressed in regards to operations or based aircraft, we'll have to take a look, let us revise their numbers, and then we'll repost our draft document out there, and then that gives the public another opportunity to skim through it, to review it, and then we will submit that document to the FAA for their review and their determination on the critical design aircraft and the operations and based aircraft forecast. So that's the key thing here, in the next, 30, 60 days or so.
30 or 60 days. Thank you. We are getting more messages.
I see there's number 17 on there about the aircraft landing and flying from the westerly direction. It's important to understand that as an aircraft operator, as a pilot, you have to land into the wind. You can have a limited tailwind, and in Heber, that generally means that you're landing to the west. So you're coming in and you're landing, going down towards the Deer Creek Reservoir. And a lot of the corporate aircraft, when they take off, are unable to do so, taking off from runway 22, again, going to the west because of restrictions in their operating specifications. And that's what they're working with the FAA right now, is to try to allow them to depart to the west that way, which we think will reduce some noise. As for aircraft that are landing, we had one of the large operators of the NetJets talk to us about trying to make a approach for them, and the airport advisory board was advocating that they cross the town at a much higher altitude to try to keep that noise impact from the city, and then just doing a circle, a tight circle to come in and land, thus reducing their footprint. But we haven't really seen anything progress from them on that since the onset of COVID. And I do apologize, I've got to go run and pick up a child here in a few minutes. My wife and I are splitting duties tonight. So if you see me drop off, that's why.
Thanks, Jason.
And to piggyback off of Jason too, when we talk about those procedures that Jason was alluding to, that's where we kind of fall back into, we are part of a national airspace system. And we all know what's west of Heber City with Salt Lake International. And Heber has to fall into place with those arriving and departing aircraft that are going into Salt Lake. So again, it's part of a puzzle, and they're working on trying to develop solutions to allow those types of operations to occur.
Thank you. We did just get one in related, why we're allowing planes to fly right down Main Street and then circle the valley before landing, doubling the risk over our town. Can you talk about the flight paths? And will they have an effect?
Yeah, so, there's a difference between, I think, some of the aircraft that might be flying lower over the valley. Some of those are local pilots, and keep in mind, we have voluntary noise restrictions, and there's, a lot of pilots that follow those. Every now and then you get some pilots that don't follow those, and we try to talk to them and try to avoid them doing things in a manner that would be considered unsafe. but the airspace is controlled by the federal government. We can't do anything about that. Once they take off, the FAA controls that airspace as much as we would like to make and help people make decisions. There's also airplanes that are coming in to land, right? The runway is fairly close to Main Street, and if you're landing towards the west, you might come in because you have to land the airplane. I think it's important to note that there's large safety requirements on the airplanes. They have to be inspected after at least every year, sometimes many more. And the last person that wants a failure of the aircraft is the pilot in the air. So, we, as a group, we try to exercise good judgment. Sometimes we have somebody that doesn't do what we'd like, and that's the place where people like Travis and myself and others that are out at the airport say something to them. So we try to self-regulate as best we can.
Just an interesting statistic. We dived into some fatality numbers for the airport and for traffic accidents. We went back to 1985 and found that there were 9 fatalities relating to the airport or aircraft at the airport. So 9 fatalities in about a 35-year period. We then looked at traffic accidents or fatalities going back just 10 years, and we found that in that 10 year there were over 73 fatalities with just traffic accidents in the valley. So statistically, aircraft travel is safer. There are accidents, however, and that's why it's so important to look at the standards to ensure that we can reduce that risk of an accident.
As Clark Kent said, and I'm probably dating myself, statistically speaking, it's still the safest way to travel.
Thank you for that. Cheryl, where are we with the next question?
Okay, sorry. The one that you just brought up was the last question that I see that has come in the past 15, 20 minutes, but there was interest. 2 things, the very last questions. Will the city consider a fuel co-op for hangar tenants and based aircraft? And then the second one, has Heber considered building a second FBO and operating it directly, or has Heber explored the potential for generating revenue by operating its own FBO?
Let me see if I can take that last question. By federal law, the city is required to accommodate anyone who desires to operate a business on the airport if there is space for that. Now, as a competitive matter, whether there's likely ever to be need for or competition for a second FBO, I think is a very questionable matter, but that's not up to us. If someone were to come in tomorrow and say they wanted to build a new FBO at the airport and there was space for it and was consistent with the master plan, the city would have to allow that to happen. Similarly, if the city wanted to enter into the business of operating FBO itself in competition with the existing FBO, it could do so. It's probably not a particularly wise decision to make. This is not the kind of airport that's likely to be able to support 2 competitive FBOs, but it's possible. And so it's certainly something that the city could consider if the economics make that work. But as a matter of law, the city can't either force an FBO to come onto the airport, nor can it prohibit one from coming onto the airport.
We've heard a lot of discussion about this, and I'm sure it'll come up a lot more as we go. There's pros and cons to all these things. If preventing any more jets from coming in is our main goal, then that changes maybe how we want to approach this airport layout plan. If you want, some people do partial use FBOs or SASOs where they provide less things, but they're not a full FBO. This is a topic that comes up a lot specifically with our pilots, and hopefully we are going to have a lot of discussion about this throughout this master plan process.
There also seems to be a lot of concern about the hangars, when they're taken down, if they're going to be taken down, how fast they're going to be rebuilt. Are there any alternatives? There was one, would it be possible to put up a temporary airplane shade that could be put up and taken down within 1 day? So I know that until we know what the airport master plan is, there's a lot of, lot we can't answer there, but that did seem to be a running theme towards the end of the evening.
Sure, I'll weigh in just a little bit on that in terms of my experience. We have displaced hangar owners at other airports because of safety standards, and I've only been doing it 12 years, but in every one of my experiences, prior to any displacement, we have provided a space, and there is a process for. So we've provided a space for them to go and rebuild, or however you want to say that, before that displacement. And then also there is a process for doing appraisals and offsetting, doing a fair market appraisal of those structures. So there are those checks in place, but it is way too premature within this process. We don't even know if those hangars are going to go away or not, and we can't know that. We don't want to predetermine those types of scenarios yet, so we just don't know.
And I think it's important, Jeremy, for people to keep perspective on this. Not only is that years off, but the city has no interest in doing something that hurts the users of the airport. And the users of the airport are the reason the airport's there. And so if it becomes necessary to move, relocate, tear down various facilities, absolutely, this part of that plan is going to be to replace those. That would not make any sense to build an airport for nobody.
Right. We did just get one in about helicopters. Is there a restriction on how low helicopters can fly? Are helicopter pilots conducting rides, and what about into the future?
I will tell you that probably the largest part of my practice is managing helicopters. Helicopters create a different kind of noise than fixed wing, and I don't think it's saying too much to say that they are irritating in a lot of communities. But the fact is, helicopters are aircraft just like fixed wing, and they're subject to the same kind of regulations that the FAA imposes on fixed wing aircraft. Now, helicopters are allowed to fly lower than fixed wing, but helicopters are aircraft and subject to the same kinds of restrictions, so the city can't impose restrictions on when and where helicopters can fly.
Thank you. Travis, do you know of any helicopter operations offering rides?
I don't know of any that are offering rides offhand. I'm trying to think of any other than friends of pilots, but I don't think that they're taking rides for hire, no. The other thing I was going to say, and Peter, you can correct me on this, is my understanding is helicopters and aircraft are required to stay at least 500 feet away from any building, structure, or person, other than when taking off or landing.
Okay. Let's see, we're actually getting down to the bottom of these questions, which is fantastic. And I do appreciate, again, everybody on the panel who is providing their expertise and their insight into these questions that the community really does have about the future of its airport. I don't think we've got any left on this page, but one of the issues that did come up in the public eye recently hasn't been asked here yet tonight, but was in that op-ed about the line from the airport FAA advisory circular. Is that something you and the group want to discuss?
What line is it from the advisory circulars?
In some cases, airport sponsors can decide not to accommodate projected growth. And how does that statement apply here to Heber?
Well, that statement is taken way out of context, and let me explain to you. If an airport is fully built out and using all of its facilities, it is not required to go out and buy new land to accommodate growth. But that's not the situation here. This is not an accommodation of growth that this master plan is considering. If you notice from the numbers that Jeremy and Jared talked about in terms of forecasts, the growth of this airport is going to be relatively modest. And so if someone were to come in, for example, tomorrow and say, will you please buy me 10 acres so that I can build a facility, the city could say no. Or will you condemn property so that I can build another facility to grow the airport? The city could say no. But that's not the situation that's present here. What we're talking about is accommodating existing users. And that's really important to keep in mind, that if you look at the forecast shows how many aircraft are using the airport today and how many are going to be using the airport in the normal growth of aviation, in the normal growth of the valley over the course of the next 20 years. And so it's really important to understand that the airport is not inducing growth. The airport is not encouraging growth. The airport is accommodating what is planned to come to this airport in the future years.
One concern I've heard expressed to me over and over again is if the city accommodates the current growth, what prevents the slippery slope, right? Today C2, tomorrow D3. What can the city do to discourage larger and larger aircraft from flying into the airport 10, 15, 20 years from now?
Really good question, Matt, and the answer is there are ends to slippery slopes, and usually in this airport, as in most, there are geographic ends. I mean, there's certain areas the airport can't keep growing. As a purely economic matter, as a practical matter, there are limits. And so the airport, for example, the city doesn't have the authority to acquire property outside the city. So you look at the city boundary. As an economic matter, there's no way the city could tear down the main intersection in town and put an airport there. It just can't happen. And so there are really practical limits to how much an airport can grow on its existing footprint. And I think you're probably seeing with the proposal that's set forth or the data that's set forth in the master plan, it's probably about the limit of what the growth will be possible at this airport.
And I'd add to that. First, I want to personally apologize if we put any of the users to sleep going over the forecast. I know it's a lot of heavy data, but there is no data or trend that we've found, and we stated such in the forecast chapter. There's nothing to support the need to go to the next thing. There's just nothing out there. You look at the national trends of the airframes that are being that are fulfilling the demand, and they're really getting more efficient and smaller in size rather than larger. At least that's what the forecast and what our research has shown.
Thank you. I hope that helps answer some of the questions that have been in the community lately. We did get another question back in, going back to helicopters. If we do have those low-flying helicopters, is there a place to lodge complaints?
I'd say yes. You can always call the airport. There's a noise complaint page on OK3's website. You can go to the FAA's website. You can go to the state's website. There's a lot of places you can go to complain about those. If they're found to be breaking rules or regulations, then my understanding is that the FAA or UDOT Aeronautics will, or the FSDO will contact those pilots and let them know.
I think that we could add it to this website as well. It doesn't hurt to have another link for people.
And going back to the helicopters with rides, like I say, I don't feel like I answered that very well. I'm not aware of any helicopters that provide rides like that here. They do that in Moab, places like that. If a company were to want to do that, then they'd have to open a business at the airport. But at this time, we don't have that.
Thank you. And links for complaints. We will add those links as well as the airport's voluntary noise mitigation elements and the purpleair.com to our website. So we did get one type of a question that you know, there is a long waiting list and people do want to bring their planes here. Are there any priorities that we can consider in the alternatives that allow for smaller planes or planes that are based out of or owned by Heber Valley citizens?
Again, I think that's something that we're going to visit as the city and as the master plan process. It could be more T hangars. It could be more larger hangars. That's going to all be part of this process, and it's going to be up to city council ultimately to decide. Which brings me to another thing I thought we might want to touch on is a lot of my neighbors and friends kind of feel like, well, okay, I understand that there's federal regulations. There's certain things that we can and cannot control, but what is it that we can control, and why should we get involved with this master plan? What real effect can we have, particularly talking about jets and things like that? So I didn't know if we wanted to touch on that or if that was one of the questions that was coming up.
I think that's a great idea. It hasn't come up in tonight's conversation, but I know it's been happening on social media. Jeremy?
Well, yeah, I'll jump in as the planner. The things that the community can control when we talk about strategic vision, I know that sounds nebulous, but to kind of drill that down, when we start looking at alternatives, there are going to be we have to strike that balance between you know, those what the sponsor wants for their goals. Is the goal to, you know, not expand whatsoever, keep it on the existing footprint, and if that is a premium goal, you know, there are going to be limitations in terms of we only have so much acreage. Now Heber City has a lot of land there, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for economic drivers. But again, that can start to compete against, you know, limiting or not wanting to encourage more traffic. So I think the user or the community has a lot of input in how to shape the airport. Now that is separate from the design safety standards that we're talking about. And I know that there's frustration that you know, that they feel like they can't control the design safety standards, but in terms of what we want the airport to be, that gets to be a local decision on many, many levels.
Yeah, and to add on to Jeremy, I mean, he's absolutely spot on in regards to layouts of apron areas and hangar development areas. That's when we get there in the facility requirements and then primarily in the alternative section, that's the vehicle to encourage public involvement and how we lay out those alternatives.
You know, if the community wants a place for people to park and view, you know, view airport or airplane landings, you know, those are things that we would look to include in the ALP. If the community, you know, I've heard about, you know, restaurants or kind of some things that tie the community closer to the aviation. All of those things are going to be community-based decisions that will really play out in the alternatives development portion of the master plan.
So that just prompted a question I have for the panel. What prevents scheduled aircraft service from landing in Heber? Why can't they come in now? And what would prevent them from doing that?
It is illegal now, and it would be illegal in the future. It's pretty straightforward.
Why is that illegal?
A commercial airliner may only land at a commercial airport. That is an airport that has an operating certificate to accept commercial airlines. The airport does not have that, and the FAA cannot force a community to accept a commercial airport operating certificate. Unless the city decides to change the nature of this airport and turn it into a commercial airport, commercial airlines can't land.
The other two limiting factors that I've heard, and Jeremy, you can maybe explain this better, but just the sheer fact that our valley is so small, those type of aircraft, they don't have an instrument approach. They can't do a go around if things don't go right. And also just the sheer demand. My understanding is to even have them consider letting you do that, you have to have an area that has a whole lot more demand than we're ever going to have. Because we got Provo and Salt Lake and those places, alleviate the need for our area.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even feel the need to go into those specifics. If the city hasn't signed a Part 139 certificate, it's 100% under the city's purview, and they've been loud and clear that there's no intention to do commercial service. So it's not even being contemplated as part of this plan. I wish Jason was still on as a pilot, because he could really, and Jared, I know you're a pilot, so maybe you can chime in, but in terms of terrain restrictions and getting precision approach, those are big deterrents for a lot of the, bigger and faster jet aircraft that may want to come in. There are just terrain and approach restrictions that are not going to go away.
Yeah, with the exception of a few small scheduled commercial service providers, operationally it would be very difficult to get those kinds of aircraft in, and that's set aside from the certificate or the Part 139 discussion. Topography wise, it's just very restrictive to get a great approach into Heber that would, from an operational standpoint, increase the likelihood of a air service provider coming in.
Thank you. We got a question in that actually went to my junk folder, so I didn't see it right away. But are there any consideration being given to how to better integrate flights that stay local, like flight training, aerobatic, etc.?
Again, there will be, we will be having those conversations. Whether the city and the community and those committees push that forward as a priority, that's going to be your decision. We're going to listen and implement the priorities as the community communicates them to us with respect to those.
I don't think we can emphasize enough to the community and to our pilots and to our locals how important this is and how much say they have in this, and the impact they can have on city council. And really, this is the part where we can really, this is an opportunity for us to fix some issues we have and to provide some wonderful opportunities. If we want a lot more things for the public or for the youth or for whatever we want, we can do whatever we want in a lot of ways. And as much as this is a difficult subject for a lot of people, there's a lot of people that come to our airport. Thousands of people come to our airport every year, and they love it and they enjoy it and they appreciate it. We need to look to those good things and the positive things and to common ground, and we can find the best solution for all these stakeholders that we have. There's a lot of stakeholders. We all want different things. We can find the best solution without making our pilots feel like we all, can't stand every pilot in the valley and all this. So I think a lot of people, there's a lot of things that people like about the airport. I understand that there's things that they don't, but there's a lot of good that comes from the airport.
Katie, do you mind if I throw out a question that I had received offline? There are some people that are interested in a turf strip. They have planes that are set up to land on turf. Again, that is something that could also be considered. I would use that as an example of potentially competing interests when you have a whole nother runway, which is essentially what a turf strip is. You start to have separation standards, and so then you start to chew up real estate, right? So those are the conversations where we need to hear from the community what the priorities are, because what we know is that the land is a limited resource. And I think our job is to help the community and really come forward with a plan that maximizes the utility of that land in the way that the community wants to see it used.
Thank you, Jeremy. On that, there was a specific question that just came through regarding a temporary tie down in the grass. If it's going to be years before more hangars are built. Travis, can Rayanne reach out to you directly to talk about that, or what process would they go through in order to learn more about getting a temporary tie down?
Yeah, they could come talk to me about that. The problem with that is we have so many people that want to do that, that it wouldn't, if you tell one person yes, how do you tell anyone else no? And then there'd be hundreds of planes all over the place. We need to figure out where we're doing what we're building. If you allow them to do it, why aren't you allowing other people to do other things? So it just gets complicated, but yes, they can talk about it.
Thanks, Travis. We actually just got a great question. Matt, if you could mute yourself, I'm sorry. Regarding communities and the how this airport master plan gets developed from the alternatives, one user asks, are you referring to Heber City or all of Heber Valley? And will county residents have any say in how the airport is developed or enlarged?
That's a great question. What I can tell you is that we asked Travis to put together those advisory committees, and very specifically, the city targeted not just city committee members, but we've got members all around the valley. So it's not just Heber City proper. It would be my answer, and I guess Matt, I would ask you to chime in on that as well, because ultimately it is the city's airport, but everything that I've heard up to this point is the desire of the sponsor, which is the city, is to take into consideration all of the valley.
That is absolutely correct. We are interested in getting input far and wide. In fact, that's exactly why we were on the radio station out of Park City, we've been in the Wave newspaper, pushing social media out. We want all the ideas. We want them to be put in the arena and allow them to compete with other ideas. So yes, if you live in the unincorporated county, please participate. Please bring your ideas forward and let us benefit from them.
Thank you. Great. One more that did get into the wrong folder that came through, and it was earlier when the mayor was talking about emergency departments using the airport, but the question ends up being no expansion is needed for our safety, correct? And I think no expansion is needed in regard to keeping emergency services at Heber Airport. So,
right, I believe at the time the mayor was referring to the type of operators that utilizes the airport. When we talk about safety or design standards, we're referring to what was discussed in the forecast, and that specific conversation that the mayor was addressing, that was referring to, I believe, some of the aerial suppression or fire suppression helicopters that was being utilized at the airport for those fires last year.
Thank you. And to be clear, that there's no additional or those emergency flights and operations were taken into consideration when counting for the forecast and things like that?
Their operations would have been addressed, either through the game cameras, through flight plans, or data collected from other sources.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I answer her question. And I think that may be the last question that's come through. So I guess I'll give the panel a chance. If there's anything that we didn't hear about tonight that you would like to bring up and make sure the community understands before we wrap up. Is there anyone in the panel who'd like to jump in?
Katie, if you don't mind, let's open up to those that are still attending tonight. And if they will turn their camera on and wave at us, we'll unmute them. But let's see if they have some questions they'd like to maybe toss our way.
Sure.
Maybe we've exhausted everyone.
The one question that I have is, will Highway 189 be affected?
Okay, I'll jump in, but Matt, maybe you go first. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
That's all right. I'm just toggling on and off my mic. I'm sorry. So will the airport master plan affect 189? The city has already come out publicly and said, no, we will not advocate moving 189 solely for the airport. Now, you got to understand that the UDOT is undertaking an environmental impact statement right now for the bypass. And that bypass may result in 189, but we don't know that. And we won't know that probably for another year or two until UDOT completes that environmental impact statement. But the city has made it very clear that they will not support moving 189 solely for the airport.
Thank you. Jeremy, is there anything you wanted to add? He was pretty emphatic. And Tim, you're next. Go right ahead.
I was just listening in and you said turn on the camera, so I did.
Oh, if you're interested in asking questions to the panel, feel free to turn on your camera. Otherwise, it's nice to see you.
Okay, thank you.
Daryl.
Just wanted to say thanks for the meeting tonight. I know you guys have a lot of pressure and it's no fun being in public office, and so appreciate your willingness to visit. One, question or clarification. It was said that the large jets don't land because of the terrain. However, we have Embraer 190s, which are 100 passenger aircraft landing. They're not commercial, which they do meet different standards, but to say the terrain will limit large jets, I think is a little misleading in this particular case.
Yeah, and Daryl, maybe that probably was my fault. I mean, it doesn't limit them, but I think it would certainly, it discourages or, I don't think it's easy for them to land. So I apologize if I, no intent to mislead there.
I didn't mean to accuse you as such. I just wanted the record to show that we do have plenty large jets who take it on themselves to use our airport.
Thanks, Daryl. Okay, I think.
This is Ryan Stack. I have one question.
Please.
Just one thing I heard earlier that I thought might be beneficial to clarify. So depending on what happens then, does the city have discretion to not change the footprint of the airport if there are other changes that still have to be made?
Yes, that's correct.
Straightforward enough.
Peter, as a follow-up to that, if I may, I know we can't limit jets landing, but as part of this expansion, is it possible to use the existing space for smaller aircraft space that would therefore limit larger jets from landing? If a big Embraer calls and says, hey, I'm coming in and there's no parking, they may decide to go to Provo or Salt Lake. So can you design, when we get to that phase, could the airport and the community use that current space within the footprint and design it specifically to limit additional large jet parking by catering to smaller piston engine and gliders and the local pilot community?
Well, the answer to your question, unfortunately, is tied to how you phrased your question. And let me rephrase your question because the answer is different. If the intent of a master plan or a development project is to limit aircraft of a certain kind, that's impermissible. If the purpose of a master plan or development project is to accommodate needed users, that is permissible. Now, needless to say, land is limited. And so if the city determines that more land is needed for small aircraft and there's a demonstrated need, and the result of that decision is there's less space available for large aircraft, that's okay. But if your intent is to limit large aircraft, that's not okay. Now, the fact is there's always a balance, and at every airport there's a balance between the small aircraft and the large aircraft, both in terms of the need and the community desire. But you have to be very careful. You can't be taking actions, the purpose of which is to limit, for example, large jets, even if the effect of that might be the case. And what many airports will do as a result is sometimes they will have, for example, a full service FBO and what's known as a light general aviation FBO, a smaller FBO that's just designed to serve small aircraft. Very common. Another common thing to do is to build self-service fueling facilities to accommodate the smaller single-engine aircraft. So there are things that an airport can do to make the airport attractive for certain categories of aircraft, but you have to be careful that what you're not doing is making it unattractive for others.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the clarification. And that would come as we get to the planning phase, correct? Not this phase, if I understand correctly.
That's correct.
Okay, well, I think that does wrap up our Q&A portion of the meeting tonight. And I'd like to thank you all for your time and your energy. We appreciate the comments. We have recorded the comments. We'll be posting answers to these questions that came up tonight, as well as the presentations and the full recording of the video onto our website in the next few days. I encourage you to go ahead and add your email address into our website if you want to be updated on when those new documents come out, as well as other blog posts or events. If you subscribe to the Flightpath email, we will be delivering those messages periodically throughout the process. Our next public meeting is scheduled for the end of June. But if you cannot wait, a reminder that the Heber City is doing a regular schedule of the airport talk and tours. The next ones up would be April 14th and April 27th. There's no registration required, and the details of those are again on our project website, HeberValleyFlightpath.com. If we don't see you at those two meetings, we do hope to see you in June for the next step of the airport master plan process, but please continue to stay involved, ask us questions. If 3 days later you've come across something that sparks some interest, we'd love to hear it. We're here to answer your questions and to keep you updated as this plan progresses. Thank you all again to the panel tonight, to our city councilmen who are here, our advisory board members, the CAC and TAC committee members, as well as, of course, the audience and our community. We really are glad you spent time with us tonight, and we hope to see you again in the future.